Okay. So today, Michael, we're going to talk about memorization, which, as you know, I find quite a thorny subject, and I have quite entrenched views about it. But I also appreciate that it's a remarkable skill which pianists develop, and I think we need to explore it further. So we're going to start by me asking you, why memorize? Why should we memorize and play from memory?
Fran, this is just my opinion, and I think that the reason why we memorize is that, well, for me personally, I started memorizing because I was a bit of a poor reader, to be honest. I always find it easier to look at my fingers, and I remember when I was a child, I would look down at my fingers and my teachers would get cross with me because she was so adamant that I need to read, which is correct. And she would cover my hands and she would whack my, wrist and slap my wrist and all this sort of stuff. But I do think that memorization, in my humble or not so humble opinion, gives the performer two very important advantages. The first is that by looking at our hands, there is a sense of accuracy. We can be a bit more accurate to see where the placement of our fingers and our hands when something feels wrong or something goes, how to correct our mistakes. Greater sense of accuracy. And the other one is that interpretively, it gives us a sense of the performer, a sense of freedom in allowing us to interpret the music. Now, I'm not saying that you can't get that freedom when you play from the score. Of course you can. It's just, in my opinion, a bit harder. Now, the paradox comes in the sense that because I'm playing a lot of chamber music at the moment, rehearsing the Tchaikovsky trio, why is it that even when we play soloists or when we perform chamber music, we are not expected to memorize, but when we play solo, we are expected to memorize? That for me is the big question that I always find a bit interesting.
I agree. I think it is a curiosity, and I think that possibly that habit comes from the original practice of playing from memory, which of course developed in the middle of the 19th century with performers like Liszt and Clara Schumann.
Yes, it was Clara Schumann. She was the first, I would say.
Yeah. And it developed into the thing that the concert pianist does, which is quite interesting because, going back to Chopin, he felt that it was an insult to the score to play from memory, because I guess he believed that, and I think Richter had said something similar, although Richter's reasons for playing from the score, of course, were rather different. But this notion that you couldn't possibly memorize all the details. But I think that, in fact, I mean, as you know, I don't play from memory because one of the reasons why is that I was never taught how to memorize when I was having lessons as a child and a teenager. And of course, when I came back to the piano in my late 30s, I just thought, I just can't, which is a silly reason, actually. And I will talk a bit about, exercising the mind a little bit later in this conversation. But I think that reflecting on that comment about, being able to remember all the details, I'm not convinced that is actually a valid point, given what you've just said about communication and the ability to play more expressively. And I know from conversations with other pianists that taking the score away and playing from memory can give one a remarkable sense of freedom of expression. And I think from an audience point of view, and from our conversations that I often speak from the point of view of a listener rather than a player, or as well as a player, is that communication and the communication of expression, emotion, narrative is what is most important in a concert experience or listening experience. So if the performer feels that that's what they're able to do by playing from memory, I don't have a problem with it at all. I think that there's a tendency for it to appear to be a circus trick, and I'm not convinced then that it's necessary. For example, there's an orchestra in the UK called Aurora, which plays from memory, and I don't know. I have to admit, I've never been to one of their concerts, but I've heard anecdotally that the experience visually is very interesting because the performers tend to stand, all the string players stand, or those that can, they can move about more because they're not tied to their music stands. But in terms of the sound and the sort of emotional experience is perhaps not quite so strong. But I think with pianists there is that we have this weight of tradition where memorization is concerned, and I think that is at once wonderful, but it can also be extremely limiting. So I wondered if you had any views about the disadvantages of playing from memory, whether there are any for you.
Yeah, look, I think it's just on that point, Fran, it's not just pianists, violinists and singers as well are expected to perform from memory, especially when we play solo. Look, the obvious disadvantage of playing from memory is that when you start to doubt yourself or when you have demons creeping in, then you forget the mistake. There's always that risk of having a memory lapse, that sort of stuff. But I'd want to say that there is a difference, in my opinion, between memorizing and remembering a piece of music. Remembering a piece of music, in my opinion, you're just relying on your muscle memory. You play it through so many times. Whereas if you actually memorize a piece of music and know a piece of music intellectually or know it well, then it stays in your intellectual memory. You're no longer relying on your muscle memory, which means that when you're nervous or anxious, things are less likely to go wrong. In my opinion. So that is, I mean, look, the crux of the matter of it is, when you remember when one memorizes or play from memory, everyone's afraid of having memory lapse. No one likes memory lapses, but the truth is that memory lapses do happen. I mean, we heard, the famous account of Sviatoslav Richter playing Beethoven's Hammerklavier in London at the festival hall, where he had that huge memory lapses, in the fugue, and then he proceeded to repeat the fugue again as an encore, and there was also a story, I don't know how true this is, I read this in a book of Arthur Schnabel playing Brahms' Second Piano Concerto with Bruno Walter, and then at one stage, Schnabel did one thing and then the orchestra did another, and then they weren't in sync, and then there was a stop, and then Walter gets, then Schnabel emerged from the piano and went and speak to the conductor, and then they resume performance, and someone in the audience who was obviously a Schnabel fan, excuse my cynicism, says that, well, Schnabel played even more beautifully than before because he was determined to make the audience forget his memory lapse. That sort of, and memory lapses do happen. And of course there was, and I've also been told by my teachers that was a very famous incident of Gilels playing the Schumann Concerto, which we all know in the last movement is absolute mind warp, when it comes to the different keys and a musical I didn't know who had a ferocious memory lapse, in the last movement of the Schumann Concerto when he played in London. So it just shows that we're all human. It happens to all of us, So yeah.
I've been present at a couple of concerts with very well-known pianists where I've witnessed a memory lapse, and it really is quite unsettling. I mean, it must be for the player, but as a member of the audience and as a pianist, it actually on both occasions it made me feel quite unwell, really. I think is the best way. The first time, and it was very obvious, it was Stephen Kovacevic playing the Schubert D959, which of course I know extremely well. And I knew the exact point in the score where it happened. It was in the finale, which is quite a busy rondo. And you could see him kind of circling round that section of the score of the piece to get back. And then he recovered, and actually he also played that movement again as an encore, and it was absolutely perfect. And I think what was really interesting too was that the audience, I mean, in general, audiences are very forgiving and very generous. I have been at concerts where comments in the interval overheard, people saying, oh well, of course they played such and such wrong, but those kinds of comments are in the minority, and I think that most people are understanding. And like you say, it does prove that we're human, and that these people that we put on a high pedestal for their brilliant performances and their musical understanding and all that kind of thing are actually human beings. And there's lots of reasons why people might have a memory lapse. An international performer who's playing this week in London, tomorrow flying to New York to play at Carnegie Hall, the next day having to travel somewhere else, that surely must put pressure on your cognitive abilities, as it were. And I think we have to be very forgiving and understanding of that.
Yes, no, I completely agree with you. Just going back, and I'm sure you live in the UK, and we all knew in the 1999 Leeds piano competition when Ilya Itin took first prize. In the finale, I think that was 4, if I remember, Rhapsodies on the theme of Paganini with CBSO and Simon Rattle, and one of the contestants, Armen Babakaryan or something from Armenia, I can't remember. When he got to the famous 18th variation, he had the memory lapse, and he went back and played it again. And of course, I think the the jury sort of like marked him down. I mean, he got 5th place, 5th or 4th. I can't remember exactly. So it does happen at the absolutely at the highest level. Another thing I do want to say, going back to what you said, is that it's actually amazing, and I find this in teaching as well, how in any sort of performance, any sort of like relationship, once human beings were very sensitive to pick up the anxiety of the next person, where as soon as the audience feel that the performance is anxious, or if something's not right, the audience instantaneously picks that up, that sort of stuff. So, and it's almost like, it's like teaching, sometimes when one is so anxious for the student to get something right, the more anxious the teacher becomes, the more anxious the student becomes, because it becomes a feedback loop, that sort of stuff. And the last thing I want to say on your point, and I absolutely agree with you, unfortunately though, we live in a world where there will always be people who goes to concerts just to find flaws or to pick holes in other people's performances. And if that's what they do, then they can I don't want to swear in our podcast, but they can just just go away basically. Then they that shows basically what it says more about who they are than than what they're actually doing at the performance. Really, I try not to judge people's wrong notes and memory lapses when I hear live performances. Of course, if there's wrong notes and memory lapses in every single bar, then one has to think, well, okay, but the odd ones, and it's all part of the journey. It's all being human.
Yeah, I totally agree. I read somewhere, it was, I think, from a British pianist in an article, saying that she found that the pressure to memorize, and I actually think that the pressure is loosening. I'm seeing more and more pianists playing less from a paper score and more from a tablet now, which is much more discreet. It can be hidden within the piano instead of, so that the music desk can still be removed or laid flat. But this person said that in her experience, and she does played a lot of chamber music as well, that the pressure to memorize meant that one was not able to learn as much repertoire. I mean, unless you're a very good memorizer, it's a process which can be very time consuming. So her argument for not memorizing was that it meant she could learn more music. But I think that goes back to your first point, that if you're a good reader, then that's fine. I mean, I'm lucky. I've always been a good reader, and I think that's possibly one of the reasons why I don't memorize, because I know I can read it. But I think she makes a valid point that it can be limiting, and it, unless you do have a prodigious memory. I mean, people like John Ogden apparently had almost a photographic memory. I think he's one of the few pianists that could play the Van Regards from memory, which, when you only have to look at the score of Messiaen.
No, I studied one piece from there. That was more than enough for me.
Yeah,
I studied one piece from there. That's more than enough for me.
To
play the entire 2 hours, that's something else.
Yeah. I mean, that's a remarkable skill to be able to memorize music like that. But so what do you think? Do you think that that's true, that it's limiting in terms of how much repertoire you can learn?
I think, Fran, that a lot of people make the mistakes that when they memorize or they attempt to memorize a piece of music, they learn the piece of music first, and then they memorize afterwards. In my experience, the easiest way to memorize is to memorize as you go along. You know, I mean, I see patterns and chords, you know, sort of like when I memorize. So that's, you know, sort of the easiest way in for me. I see shapes, you know, on the keyboard. But that's just my personal point of view. I completely agree. That's you know, I mean, some people are fantastic readers and they don't have to memorize. But here's the question I want to ask though. You know, how does one play double octaves looking at the score, or play stuff such as the last movement of Schoenberg's Opus 11? Surely it's easier looking at your hands to see where the shapes of the chords and where your hands needs to go. In my opinion, that's just my personal experience. You know, I mean, hats off to you if you can do that convincingly. You know, sort of, I'll buy you dinner at any restaurant you want. You know.
Yeah. Oh, I think there's a lot in that. And I mean, I say I don't memorize, but sections like that in pieces, especially where I've had to perform, you know, in public or in a diploma recital situation, all of that kind of thing, yeah, is memorized because there's no other way of doing it. You've got to look at your hands. You know, and I don't have that kind of amazing spatial awareness and knowledge of the keyboard layout and geography to be able to do that kind of thing without looking down. And I think a lot of people are the same. Yeah.
Yeah. And also, this maybe sound like a bit of a generalization, and you could correct me if I'm wrong. And perhaps I should have said this initially. By memorizing, it also allows us to play the piece faster, you know, because you're obviously looking at your, you know, your fingers. But again, that's a controversial point. Some people might agree with that. Some people might not agree with that. You know, that's sort of. I personally find it quite difficult to have divided loyalties. For example, to look up and look down. Yeah, and I think that's the most carnal of carnal sin, the most heinous of performance sin, to not memorize the piece properly, and then to have the score up there up on the, you know, on the piano, just as a sort of safety net, because it's happened to me numerous times. Because, you know, I was like, yeah, I sort of like half memorized the piece, but then, you know, I thought, you know, let me just have the score up there just to be safe, you know, that sort of stuff. Then the performance goes really well, and at one stage, you know, something in the back of my mind said, well, is that, you know, B flat in the left hand? And I looked up and I said, oh, it is a B flat. Then I looked down in my hands and I completely lose my place, you know. So that sort of stuff. So if you want to play with the score in front of you, my advice to you is that practice with the score in front of you, and then be very specific where you look up and where you're looking at the score, and when you're going to look down again. That's my advice.
Yeah, I think that's very sound advice, and that's certainly something that I know I've done. Talking about cognition and sort of brain function, as it were, I had an interesting conversation with somebody who came to stay with me a couple of months ago, specifically to play my piano and to play her diploma program for me, which was a very big, complex program. It included Beethoven's Waldstein and a contemporary piece. She played everything from memory. And I came out with my usual comments about memorization. And she said that, you know, one of the reasons why she memorized was because as we get older, we need to exercise the grey matter. And it's, you know, it's known that doing things like crosswords, Sudoku, playing Scrabble, learning a new skill, memorizing music actually is very good for one's brain health. And I thought this was a really good point, and it wasn't really something I'd thought about before. And actually, after that conversation, I thought, right, I am going to now try and memorize not complicated music, not the Rachmaninoff Etude tableau that I'm learning at the moment, but something simple and as an exercise for the brain rather than as a pianistic exercise. I think that's such a valid point. And studies do show that pianists have a overdeveloped area of the brain like London taxi drivers because of the memory function, which is quite interesting. So I think that she makes a really good point, and I perhaps from the point of view of an amateur pianist in particular, that exercising the brain in that way as we get older is as good a reason as any to memorize.
I think so. I completely agree. And you also another point that I want to add on top of that, Fran, is that I have to quote Neil Ilmerman now, one of my teachers in London, and he always said to me that, the memory is just like any muscle in your body. The more you use it, the stronger it becomes. Yeah. That's all. So and that's all I can say about that. I completely agree with you. That sort of stuff. But I must say though, on that note, that pianists shouldn't feel pressure to memorize, and they must. It's at the end of the day when they play performance and recital, they must do what they feel most comfortable with. Because it's enough pressure going up there and playing with the orchestra, playing in front of an audience. Why put yourself under more pressure if you don't trust your memory? Just have the bloody score up there. I'm sorry to say this.
Yeah, I think that's a very good point. I actually remember meeting a chap who was a postgrad or last year student at the Royal College some years ago, who told me that he had made a decision not to pursue a career as a soloist because he found the pressure of memorizing too great, and it just added to the performance anxiety that one inevitably feels anyway. It's another layer of anxiety, and I think if you don't need to, don't do it. As I said earlier, I think the pressure is loosening, and I think the trend away from you're not a proper pianist if you don't play from memory which is a criticism that's been leveled at me, which is why I'm quite militant on this subject. I think that is actually fading, and as I said, we're seeing more people playing from iPads and tablets, and also good old-fashioned scores. Then of course there's a difficulty of whether you have a page turner or you turn yourself. And I've had experience with page turners. I'm lucky, actually. I've had all the people that have turned for me for my diplomas have been very good, including a friend who couldn't read music, which meant we had to rely on a very clear series of head nods and other signs. But so then you add something extra if you're playing from the score with a page turner. You need the whole thing to be a very slick process, so that page turning doesn't get in the way. And when I say get in the way, I mean from the point of view of the performer, it needs to be discreet, but also from the audience's point of view. I have been to concerts where there have been some quite interesting, shall we say, exchanges between performer and page turner, which have almost turned into kind of comedy, and it shouldn't have done, but I won't name names. But I think that, especially from the point of view of the amateur, we should be encouraging people to do what they feel most comfortable with and what will enable them to play at their best. And I have to say, and I've said this lots of times before, I've been to concerts where it's been a performance without the score, performance from memory, and it has been as dull as ditch water. I've been to others where the pianist has played from an old-fashioned score or a tablet, and it has been a remarkable experience of communication and expression and drama. So, I think it has to be a personal choice. I think we need to take the pressure off pianists to do this. And I think we also have to remind people that this is a fairly recent habit, not quite 200 years of playing from memory. And just not be quite so militant about it, because it really does seem to create this kind of us and them attitude, that in one corner there's the memorizers, and in the other corner there's the people like me, which are like, well, I'm just going to do what I feel most comfortable doing. And I think that can be very limiting for amateur pianists in particular, to feel that they're under pressure.
Look, Fran, I completely agree with you. I couldn't give a flying stuff whether or not you play from memory or play from the score. I am old-fashioned. I just want to hear convincing interpretation. That's all. I don't care how you do it.
Yeah.
I try playing from tablets and it doesn't work because I find that the score very difficult to read.
I agree.
On tablet. I prefer old-fashioned score at times. But yeah, I think one should do what one feels comfortable with. That's all. And I think that's my conclusion. And at the end of the day, it's your performance. Stuff who else thinks about it. I want to hear the music.
Yeah.
And I think that's the most important part.
100% agree. I see from the clock, Michael, that we're running out of time. So as usual, we'll consign something to room 101, the piano room 101. So you know what I'm going to say. It's
okay, you go first.
It's the whole thing. You're not a proper pianist if you don't play from memory, which of course is rubbish. So that is going in room 101, along with the person that actually said that to me once. And interestingly, this was somebody who was not able to get through a piece without having a huge memory lapse, and she hadn't even turned up to piano club with a score in her handbag. So booyah to that. Right, that's my room 101 candidate. Over to you.
I actually don't have anything to add. I think my room 101 candidate will probably be the opposite of what you suggested. Of what you consigned would be people who is determined to memorize or felt that they, for whatever reason, obliged to memorize, but then somehow memorization is not for them. That sort of stuff. I just want to say, life is too short. Take the pressure off yourself. Do what you feel most comfortable with.
Yeah, that should be the rule for life, really, with everything, especially when you're playing the piano. Yeah. Well, that's great. Thank you, Michael. That's an interesting conversation. I'm sure it's going to create some conversation when we share this online, which is good because we want people to engage, comment. Yes. And we will meet again next month for another conversation around the piano. Find some more things to put in Piano 101's room. Yeah. And I shall speak to you again soon.